The Dark Ages were actually bright. Imagine this. You're standing inside a vast cathedral in medieval France. The air is cool, the stones rise hundreds of feet above you, and colored light streams through stained glass windows, painting the floor in blue and red. You look around and realize this is no crude or backwards place. This is the product of centuries of mathematics, engineering, artistry, and devotion. And yet, for a long time, people have been taught that this period, the Middle Ages, was a time of darkness, a time of ignorance, superstition, and decline. We even use the phrase, the Dark Ages, casually, as if to describe anything hopeless, outdated, or backwards. But here's the thing, that story isn't true. In fact, what we call the Dark Ages were full of innovation, creativity, and discovery, the kind that laid the groundwork for the modern world. Tonight, let's take a calm journey through the so-called Dark Ages and discover why this era may have been one of the brightest in human history. Why we call them the Dark Ages. The term Dark Ages actually comes from one man, Francesco Petrarch, an Italian poet in the 14th century. He looked back at the centuries after Rome's fall and called them dark because in his eyes, Europe had lost the light of classical learning. Later, Renaissance thinkers repeated the insult, and Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire took it even further, mocking the Middle Ages as the thousand-year wasteland of ignorance. It's a catchy label, sure, but it's also deeply misleading. Modern historians actually hate the term. Oxford University Press, for example, has banned its writers from using Dark Ages in academic work. And for good reason, it's not just inaccurate, it's unfair. It hides the remarkable creativity of the era and makes us think nothing important happened between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance. The truth is, a lot happened. Farming, food, and the medieval agricultural revolution. Let's start with something simple but essential. Food. In the early Middle Ages, Europe was mostly rural. The survival of families depended on farming, and for centuries, agriculture had been tough. The soils of northern Europe were heavy and hard to work with the old Roman plows. But by the 8th and ninth centuries, something revolutionary appeared. The heavy plow. This wasn't just a slightly better tool, it was a game changer. The heavy plow could dig into thick, wet soil, turning it over and making it fertile. It unlocked lands that had never been used for farming before. And pulling that plow? Horses. But not just any horses. Thanks to the horse collar, another medieval invention, farmers could harness a horse's strength without choking it. Add the horseshoe, and suddenly horses were more efficient than oxen. Fields could be plowed faster, and more food could be grown. Then came the three-field system. Instead of dividing land into two fields, one planted, one resting, farmers split it into three. One for autumn crops like wheat, one for spring crops like oats or peas, and one left fallow. This meant two harvests instead of one. More food, more variety, better nutrition. Together, these changes sparked what historians call the medieval agricultural revolution. Populations grew, towns expanded, and with extra food, people had time to do other things, like build, study, and invent. Not bad for an era supposedly dark. The power of water, wind, and machines. Now, picture the sound of rushing water turning a wheel. By the 11th century, Europe was filled with watermills. They ground grain into flour, sawed wood, hammered metal, even pressed olives. Imagine thousands of medieval factories scattered across the landscape, all powered not by steam or electricity, but by flowing rivers. And where rivers weren't enough, people turned to the windmill. By the 12th and 13th centuries, these tall wooden towers dotted the European countryside. This wasn't just convenience, it was an energy revolution. At its height, medieval Europe had more mills per capita than the Roman Empire ever dreamed of. Everyday life was being transformed by clever uses of mechanical power. Learning, science, and the birth of universities. It wasn't only technology. The Middle Ages also gave us something that still defines our world today, the university. Think of Bologna in 1088, Paris around 1150, Oxford in 1167. Students from all over Europe would gather in cold stone halls, wrapped in cloaks, debating philosophy, law, and medicine. Professors would read aloud from Aristotle or newly translated works of Arabic scholars. These weren't backward places. They were hubs of international learning. Ideas traveled with students, with books, with merchants, and the discoveries were real. The Persian mathematician al-Khwarizmi introduced algebra. His name gives us the word algorithm. Latin translations of his works spread through Europe. Scholars tinkered with astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. In the 13th century, thinkers like Roger Bacon at Oxford studied optics and experimented with lenses. Out of this came one of the most life-changing medieval inventions, eyeglasses. Imagine how many scholars, monks, and scribes suddenly had their working lives extended by decades because they could see clearly again. And let's not forget the mechanical clock. By the 14th century, public squares across Europe rang with bells from the first weight-driven timekeepers. For the first time, hours weren't just measured by sunlight or church prayers, they were ticked off mechanically, with gears and escapements. These are not the inventions of an age that hated science. They're the tools of an age that was obsessed with it. Cathedrals, the skyscrapers of the Middle Ages. Now, let's step back into that cathedral we imagined at the start. How did people in the 12th century, without cranes or steel, build something like Chartres Cathedral, with soaring vaults, delicate stone tracery, and windows taller than most modern houses? The answer is engineering genius. Medieval architects developed the ribbed vault, the pointed arch, and the flying buttress. These weren't just aesthetic choices, they were brilliant solutions to structural problems. They allowed walls to be thinner, buildings to be taller, and windows to be bigger. When you see a Gothic cathedral, you're looking at the cutting edge of medieval technology. These buildings were the skyscrapers of their day, requiring careful geometry, precise mathematics, and entire armies of skilled craftsmen. Far from crude, these structures remain some of the most impressive engineering feats in history. Why the myth survived. So why do we still hear about the Dark Ages? Partly because of the Renaissance, which liked to define itself by contrast. If the Renaissance was a rebirth, then the centuries before had to be dead. And later, Enlightenment thinkers doubled down, painting the medieval world as dominated by superstition and religion, with no room for science. But that's propaganda, not history. In reality, the Church often supported learning, founding universities, and preserving ancient texts. Monasteries copied manuscripts tirelessly. Scholars debated Aristotle, Plato, and the Bible in equal measure. Yes, Europe had its share of war, famine, and ignorance, but so has every era. To call 1,000 years dark because they don't look like modern times is to ignore their brilliance, a brighter legacy. When we strip away the myth, we find that the Middle Ages were anything but stagnant. They gave us the heavy plow and the horse collar, the watermill and the windmill, universities, eyeglasses, mechanical clocks, algebra, Gothic cathedrals, and even musical notation. So next time you hear the phrase, remember, the Dark Ages weren't really dark. They were full of light, sometimes streaming through stained glass, sometimes glinting off a polished astrolabe, sometimes ticking inside the gears of a medieval clock. And maybe, just maybe, we should call them what they truly were, an age of innovation, an age of discovery, and an age of surprising brilliance. Healing hands and early medicine. Picture a medieval monastery at dawn. Candles flicker against stone walls as a monk carefully grinds herbs with a mortar and pestle. Shelves around him are lined with jars, dried lavender, mint, sage, willow bark. To us, it looks rustic. But for him, this is medicine, practical, tested, and passed down over generations. In the Middle Ages, medicine was a blend of the old and the new. Ancient Roman and Greek texts still circulated, but they were joined by medical works from the Islamic world. One of the most important was Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, written in Persia in the 11th century. When translated into Latin, it became the medical textbook of Europe for hundreds of years. Hospitals also began to emerge in their recognizable form. Many were run by monasteries or charitable orders, offering shelter, food, and care not just to the sick, but also to travelers and the poor. They weren't hospitals as we know them, but they introduced the idea of organized communal healthcare. And then there were the surgeons. Far from the stereotype of bumbling hacks, many medieval surgeons were remarkably skilled. They set broken bones, treated wounds, and even performed eye surgeries to remove cataracts. They developed anesthetic mixtures, sometimes called soporific sponges, made of herbs like opium poppy, mandrake, and henbane. Crude, yes, but effective enough to dull pain in a world before modern medicine. So while it's true that medieval medicine could be dangerous or strange by our standards, bloodletting, for example, was common, it was also a time of experimentation and exchange. Much of the medical knowledge we take for granted today passed through this era, preserved and refined by medieval hands. The sea, Vikings, compasses, and exploration. Now, let's leave the monastery and step onto a ship. The salt spray hits your face, and the creak of wooden planks echoes underfoot. Above you, a square sail snaps in the wind. You're aboard a Viking longship, designed with such precision that it can cross the stormy North Atlantic and navigate shallow rivers with ease. For centuries, people have imagined the Vikings as only raiders, but they were also explorers and settlers. They sailed to Iceland, Greenland, and even reached North America around the year 1000, building a short-lived settlement at a place we now call L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. Elsewhere in the world, sailors were innovating too. Arab navigators used the astrolabe, a marvel of mathematics and craftsmanship, to chart the stars and measure latitude. By the 12th century, Europeans were learning to use it as well. Around the same time, the magnetic compass arrived in Europe from China, revolutionizing navigation. For the first time, sailors could confidently cross seas, even when clouds hid the stars. Shipbuilding improved as well. In the Mediterranean, sturdy galleys carried merchants from Venice and Genoa, connecting Europe with North Africa and the Middle East. In the north, cog ships hauled cargo across the Baltic and North Seas, fueling the rise of the Hanseatic League, a powerful network of trading cities. These advances in navigation and trade didn't just expand horizons, they connected worlds. Pepper from India, silk from China, and gold from Africa all found their way into medieval markets. A person walking through Venice in the 13th century might hear half a dozen languages, smell spices from thousands of miles away, and see fabrics shimmering with dyes unknown in Europe. The seas of the so-called Dark Ages were alive with movement. They were not barriers, but bridges. Everyday life and hidden inventions. When we talk about innovation, we usually think of big inventions like the printing press or the steam engine, but the Middle Ages also brought countless small, quiet innovations that shaped daily life. Take writing. Around the late 8th and 9th centuries, under the rule of Charlemagne, scribes developed a new script called Carolingian minuscule. It might not sound exciting, but this style of writing, neat, rounded, with spaces between words, was a revolution. Suddenly, texts were easier to read and copy. This script eventually evolved into the basis of modern lowercase letters. In a sense, every time you type a lowercase a, you're looking at the legacy of the medieval scribes. Then there was money. As trade expanded, carrying piles of coins became impractical and dangerous. In Italian city-states like Florence, merchants developed early banking systems. They issued letters of credit, a kind of medieval traveler's check that allowed merchants to move wealth across Europe without lugging around sacks of silver. This was the beginning of modern banking. Guilds, too, reshaped everyday work. These were associations of artisans, blacksmiths, weavers, stonemasons, who organized themselves to train apprentices, set standards, and protect their trades. If you've ever been part of a union or professional association, you've experienced the descendant of these medieval guilds. Even cooking and domestic life saw subtle innovations. New crops like buckwheat and rice spread into Europe, while advances in pottery and iron tools improved kitchens. And of course, brewing beer and fermenting wine were refined into crafts so central to medieval culture that they remain with us today. It wasn't all knights and castles. Medieval innovation lived in bread ovens, quills, ledgers, and spinning wheels. Art, music, and storytelling. Picture a monk hunched over a manuscript, dipping his quill into ink. But this isn't just black and white text. The margins bloom with gold leaf, tiny flowers, and fantastical creatures. Some manuscripts even hide little jokes in the corners, rabbits fighting knights, or snails charging into battle. These illuminated manuscripts weren't just books, they were treasures, meant to dazzle as much as to teach. Music also transformed. Before the 9th century, music was fleeting. It had to be taught and remembered by ear. Then, monks began marking chants with simple symbols, which evolved into the staff notation we still use today. This innovation made it possible to preserve and share music across generations and regions. Without it, the great symphonies of later centuries would never have been written. And then there was literature. Beowulf told of heroism and monsters in Anglo-Saxon England. The Song of Roland celebrated knightly valor in France. And Dante's Divine Comedy, written in the early 14th century, guided readers through hell, purgatory, and paradise, an epic that still resonates with readers around the world. Far from being silent or colorless, the Middle Ages were rich with stories, songs, and art, a reminder that humans in every age seek beauty, meaning, and connection. Law, order, and early democracy. When we think of medieval politics, it's easy to picture only kings and castles. But the Middle Ages also saw the slow, steady rise of new systems of law and governance. In 1215, a group of English barons forced King John to sign the Magna Carta. It was a practical document at first, mainly about barons protecting their rights, but its legacy was profound. It established the idea that even kings must obey the law. Over time, that seed grew into concepts of constitutional government and individual rights. Elsewhere, towns were granted charters, written agreements that gave them privileges like self-governance, trade rights, and protection under law. These charters gave rise to a new sense of civic identity. A merchant in a free town had rights that tied him to his community, in a way peasants under feudal lords did not. In Italy and parts of Spain, city-states experimented with republican government, where councils of merchants and guild members shaped policies. In Scandinavia, assemblies called things allowed free men to debate and decide laws together. These weren't modern democracies, but they laid foundations for representative government. And let's not forget law itself. Medieval scholars in Bologna rediscovered Roman legal texts and began to codify laws systematically. This scholarship influenced not just Europe, but also later legal traditions worldwide. So even in the so-called Dark Ages, the idea of justice was being debated, written down, and shaped into systems that still affect us today. A connected world. Finally, we need to step back and see the bigger picture. The Middle Ages weren't just a European story, they were part of a global network of exchange. In the Islamic world, cities like Baghdad and Cordoba flourished as centers of learning. Scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, added their own discoveries, and passed them on. Algebra, astronomy, and medicine all traveled west through Spain and Sicily, enriching European scholarship. From China came paper, a technology that transformed record-keeping and education. Later, gunpowder and the compass arrived as well, reshaping warfare and exploration. Even in the Americas, unconnected to Europe at the time, societies like the Maya, Aztec, and Inca were achieving their own stunning feats of engineering and astronomy. The Middle Ages were not isolated. They were a time of movement, exchange, and cross-cultural fertilization. And the so-called Dark Ages were in truth an era where the light of knowledge moved across continents. Beyond the forests and fields, the Dark Ages were also a time of slow, intellectual stirrings. While much of Europe had retreated into rural simplicity, there were pockets where thought and learning quietly persisted. In Ireland and Scotland, monasteries perched on isolated islands or rugged cliffs became beacons of scholarship. Here, scholars studied Latin texts, copied classical works, and even wrote their own treatises on medicine, astronomy, and philosophy. These monks were travelers of the mind as much as they were of the spirit, charting ideas that would one day return to the continent in waves of rediscovery. Meanwhile, in the eastern reaches of Europe, Byzantine culture endured. Constantinople, its golden domes catching the Mediterranean sun, preserved Roman law, Greek learning, and magnificent art. The empire's libraries, mosaics, and grand churches bore witness to a civilization that refused to vanish, even as the Western lands descended into decentralized chaos. Trade and diplomacy continued across the Mediterranean, carrying spices, silks, and ideas, connecting distant corners of the known world in subtle, almost invisible threads. In quieter corners of the continent, local rulers experimented with governance, forming charters, collecting tolls, and managing small domains. Laws were often unwritten, passed down through custom, memory, and the occasional proclamation from a lord or king. Justice might be swift or slow, harsh, or surprisingly fair, depending on the whim of those in power, but it reflected an evolving understanding of order, responsibility, and community. The Dark Ages were also a time of exploration within the natural world. Monks maintained herb gardens, experimenting with plants for food, medicine, and dye. Artisans discovered new alloys and techniques for metalwork, while carpenters, masons, and weavers honed their crafts with patient precision. Even in the absence of grand universities or formal laboratories, human curiosity quietly persisted, seeking to understand the world in ways both practical and poetic. Religion, of course, continued to shape both thought and society. Pilgrimages traced well-worn paths from humble shrines to great cathedrals. Relics of saints drew the faithful from faraway lands, and the quiet rhythm of prayer structured lives in ways subtle but profound. Festivals, feasts, and holy days offered brief respite from labor, punctuating the long year with moments of community, music, and storytelling. These rituals, repeated over generations, wove a fabric of shared experience, anchoring lives in meaning even amid uncertainty. Even warfare carried lessons of adaptation. Fortifications evolved from simple wooden palisades to stone keeps, strategically positioned to control trade routes, river crossings, and fertile lands. Armor, weapons, and tactics improved gradually, while knights and local levies became central figures in regional power. Though battles were often brutal and unpredictable, they forced innovation, negotiation, and the slow development of political structures that would endure for centuries. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this era is its quiet continuity. Families tilled the same fields for generations, knowledge passed orally from parent to child, village to village. Songs, proverbs, and folk tales traveled long before letters or books could. In these rhythms of work, worship, and storytelling, life persisted, not glamorous or swift, but persistent, patient, and profoundly human. As the ninth and 10th centuries passed, subtle changes began to ripple outward. Trade networks slowly expanded along rivers, forests, and coasts. Towns began to emerge near castle gates and river crossings. Craftsmen honed specialized skills, forming the early guilds that would later shape urban life. Though centuries had passed since Rome, the foundations for a more interconnected, literate, and complex Europe were quietly being laid. So imagine for a moment standing on a quiet hill in the early 10th century. Below, a village rests by the river. Smoke rises from chimneys. Children run barefoot along earthen paths. Monks chant softly in distant abbeys. Somewhere a blacksmith hammers metal, a merchant counts coins, a traveler rides slowly toward a distant town. Time feels slower, the world quieter, yet beneath the surface, human life continues to hum with persistence, creativity, and hope. This was the world of the Dark Ages, not simply an absence of light, but a subtle, intricate, and enduring pattern of life. The world was waiting, quietly, for the changes that would one day bloom into the Middle Ages and eventually the dawn of a new era. Daily life in a medieval village was a slow, measured rhythm governed by seasons and the land itself. In spring, the fields were plowed and sown, the soil turned by wooden plows guided by strong hands and oxen. Summer brought the warmth of the sun, the steady work of weeding, tending animals, and harvesting the ripening crops. Autumn was the season of gathering, of storing grain and firewood for the long winter months. And winter, when the earth slept beneath frost and snow, offered quiet nights by the fire, where families told stories and repaired tools or garments. Families were the heart of village life. Women managed households, spun wool into yarn, wove cloth, tended kitchens and gardens, and cared for children and the elderly. They passed knowledge of herbs, midwifery, and cooking from one generation to the next. Men worked the fields, hunted, and maintained buildings, yet life was rarely divided strictly by gender. Survival depended on cooperation, and every member of the family contributed in ways both visible and unseen. Children learned by observing, imitating, and helping, gradually stepping into the roles of adults as they grew. Travel, though often slow and arduous, connected villages, towns, and distant lands. Rivers served as highways, carrying merchants, pilgrims, and messengers. Overland, roads were rough and uneven, marked by the footprints of countless travelers, their carts leaving tracks through mud and dust. Inns and monasteries offered shelter, and travelers exchanged news, goods, and ideas along the way. Though movement was slower than today, it created a web of connection, a quiet network that linked even the most isolated communities to the wider world. Rulers and kings shaped the world from their castles and courts. Some were mighty and ambitious, seeking to expand their domains, while others were cautious, balancing the demands of local lords, merchants, and the church. Charlemagne's efforts to unite much of Western Europe were followed by centuries of smaller kingdoms, feudal obligations, and local allegiances. Even in times of political instability, villages and families adapted, finding continuity and rhythm in everyday life despite distant conflicts. The folklore of the period also flourished, carried by voices rather than books. Stories of fairies, spirits, and forest guardians drifted through villages. Legends of heroic deeds, clever tricksters, and moral lessons were told around fires, sung in ballads, or whispered to children before sleep. Saints' lives were recounted as both inspiration and caution. Tales of miracles and devotion shaping the moral imagination of communities. Superstitions and beliefs permeated every aspect of life. People watched the skies for omens, interpreted the patterns of stars, and tended sacred groves or springs. Even the simplest actions, planting, harvesting, preparing meals, were sometimes accompanied by prayers, charms, or small rituals meant to protect families from harm. These quiet practices gave structure to daily life and a sense of control in an often unpredictable world. Crafts and early industry moved forward at a measured pace. Blacksmiths shaped iron into tools and weapons. Weavers created textiles, often richly patterned or dyed from local plants. Carpenters, masons, and stonemasons built homes, bridges, and fortifications with patient skill. These small innovations, passed along through apprenticeships and oral instruction, quietly improved the material world and laid the foundation for future towns and cities. Even in the shadows of hardship, famine, disease, or the occasional raid, people found resilience. Communities shared food, repaired homes, tended the sick, and supported each other through labor and celebration. Joy was found in simple pleasures, a well-tended garden, a harvest festival, the laughter of children, the soft music of flutes and lyres. The human spirit, steady and enduring, persisted beneath the slow unfolding of history. And so, by the end of the Dark Ages, Europe had transformed in subtle ways. Trade networks expanded along rivers, roads, and coasts. Towns and markets began to grow. Knowledge, preserved in monasteries and shared in oral tradition, prepared the way for the flowering of learning to come. Though the era is often called dark, it was not empty. It was a time of quiet persistence, of life continuing in its most essential patient forms. Picture it now, a village by a gently flowing river. Smoke rises from chimneys into a pale sky. Children run along earthen paths. Monks chant softly in distant abbeys. Somewhere, a blacksmith hammers steadily, a merchant counts coins, and a traveler rests under the shade of a tree. The wind moves through forests. The river carries its water slowly onward, and life endures, quietly, patiently, beautifully. This was the Dark Ages, not a time of nothing, but a time of persistence, of beginnings hidden in simplicity, of the human story weaving itself gently through history. Around the 5th century, Europe stood on the edge of a profound transformation. Rome, that mighty city whose walls and aqueducts had stretched across continents, had crumbled under the pressures of internal decay, economic strain, and waves of invading peoples. The intricate machinery of Roman administration fell apart, and with it, the sense of centralized order that had bound the continent together for centuries. People often speak of darkness when they imagine these times, yet it was less a void and more a dimly flickering candle. Small lights of culture, learning, and resilience persisted, hidden in the shadows. Monasteries, perched on quiet hillsides, became guardians of knowledge. Scribes painstakingly copied ancient manuscripts, preserving the wisdom of the Greeks, Romans, and early Christians. It was here, in the silence of candlelit scriptoria, that the faint threads of continuity endured. The lives of ordinary people, however, were often marked by uncertainty. Farms dotted the countryside, villages huddled near rivers, and communities relied upon the rhythm of seasons. Disease, famine, and the occasional raid by wandering warriors were constant companions. Yet, life went on, slowly, steadily, with each generation learning to adapt to a world without empire-wide order. And then there were the wanderers, the Germanic tribes, the Vikings, the Magyars, whose movements reshaped the map of Europe. Kingdoms rose and fell, alliances were formed, and the seeds of nations we know today were planted, often in soil tilled by conflict. These centuries were not empty. They were a crucible, forging new political structures, new cultures, and new identities. Amidst the turmoil, art and architecture found their own subtle expression. Simple wooden churches gave way to the soaring stone cathedrals that would come centuries later. Illuminated manuscripts glimmered with intricate designs, telling stories of saints and kings in gentle, painstaking detail. Music, though mostly unrecorded, echoed in the chants of monks and the songs of wandering minstrels. Even in what some would call darkness, human creativity endured. Trade, though limited compared to the Roman era, continued quietly. Merchants traveled by rivers and along dusty roads, exchanging not just goods, but ideas. Salt, wool, and iron moved across the continent, linking distant communities in subtle networks of connection. And while literacy was rare, oral storytelling preserved history, legends, and moral lessons, echoing through generations like a gentle, continuous hum. It was also a time of profound religious transformation. Christianity spread steadily, entwining with local customs and forming the spiritual backbone of Europe for centuries to come. The Church, wielding both moral and political influence, became a central institution in a world where kings and warlords often ruled through might alone. Pilgrimages, relics, and the quiet devotion of countless believers wove a tapestry of faith across the land. By the end of the first millennium, the so-called Dark Ages had given way to new growth. Towns began to flourish once more, universities would eventually rise, and a slow renaissance of thought and culture would emerge. Yet, in reflecting on this era, one realizes that it was never truly dark. It was a time of transformation, endurance, and quiet innovation, a period where human resilience flickered like candlelight through the shadows of history. As the centuries unfolded, the landscape of Europe was ever-changing. Forests grew dense where cities once thrived, and rivers meandered through quiet valleys, carrying travelers and merchants on gentle currents. Life moved at a rhythm dictated not by clocks, but by the sun, the seasons, and the toil of human hands. Consider the wandering tribes of this era. The Saxons, Angles, and Jutes crossed from the shores of what we now call Denmark and northern Germany, settling in the lands of Britain. Over time, they carved out new kingdoms, their old ways blending with the remnants of Roman Britain, forming a patchwork of culture and tradition that would endure for centuries. The Celts, too, kept their own stories alive, speaking in forests and hills where Roman roads had long since crumbled. Meanwhile, further east, the Slavic peoples were establishing villages along rivers and lakes, laying the groundwork for kingdoms that would rise long after the fall of Rome. Life in these settlements was quiet yet purposeful. Fields of rye and barley swayed in the wind. Flocks of sheep grazed on gentle hillsides, and the ringing of hammers in small forges marked the steady rhythm of everyday life. In the north, the Vikings began their journeys across icy seas. Initially seen as raiders and marauders, they were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Longships carved through fjords and rivers, carrying men and women to distant lands. Their settlements in the British Isles, Normandy, and even as far as the rivers of Russia left enduring legacies. Yet, their impact was not just in conquest, it was in cultural exchange, in tales of bravery and cunning, in new routes that linked distant shores. Back in the heart of Europe, kingdoms like the Franks rose under leaders such as Clovis and later Charlemagne, who would unite much of Western Europe under a single crown. Charlemagne, in particular, sought to revive learning, founding schools, and encouraging the copying of manuscripts. Though the world was far from the splendor of ancient Rome, these efforts planted seeds for a future awakening. Life was often harsh, but the people found comfort in routines and rituals. The turning of the seasons marked festivals and holy days. Spring brought planting, summer brought harvests, and winter brought quiet nights by the fire, storytelling, and reflection. Monks recorded events, chronicled genealogies, and maintained knowledge, all by the flicker of candlelight. In the quiet, the human spirit endured. Even the simplest of innovations left a quiet mark. Watermills ground grain with tireless precision. Windmills began to turn across flat plains, and rudimentary plows made farming slightly less arduous. Roads, though fewer and rougher than in Roman times, carried goods and stories from village to village. In every small act, humanity adapted, persisted, and created a foundation for the centuries to come. The culture of the time, often overlooked, had its own quiet beauty. Manuscripts glimmered with gold and vibrant colors. Churches echoed with soft Gregorian chants, and the walls of castles and fortifications, though utilitarian, spoke of skill and craftsmanship. Jewelry, pottery, and textiles were painstakingly crafted, carrying subtle designs that reflected both necessity and artistry. Even travel and trade had their gentle rhythms. Markets grew near rivers, crossroads, and castle gates, where merchants exchanged cloth, salt, iron, and sometimes exotic goods from faraway lands. Ideas, too, were carried along these routes. Religious beliefs, local legends, and snippets of distant culture spread slowly but steadily, intertwining communities and shaping identities. And then there were the quiet, unseen struggles, the illnesses, the famines, the political intrigue, but always balanced by resilience. Communities adapted, built dikes and defenses, learned to live with harsh winters, and shared knowledge in subtle ways that would ensure survival. Though historians often speak of this era as dark, the human story within it is anything but empty. It is a story of endurance, quiet ingenuity, and continuity. By the end of the first millennium, as Europe slowly emerged into what would become the High Middle Ages, towns began to grow, trade networks expanded, and the seeds of universities were planted. The flickering lights of the monasteries had grown into beacons, and the threads of culture, learning, and governance began to weave into the rich tapestry of medieval Europe. So now, as you drift in thought, imagine the sound of flowing rivers, the soft rustle of leaves in dense forests, the faint tolling of distant bells, and the candlelight of a scriptorium. This is the world of the Dark Ages, quiet, fragile, yet profoundly alive. A world that endured, transformed, and gently gave rise to the centuries that followed.